the first question that I want to take up was a written question. Was, will people be able to smoke weed in socialism? What was the question? But seriously, there are. If you can be serious after that, it's not going to be a law that people, can't find ways to enjoy themselves and get high from time to time. But if people are making a way of life out of getting high, that could be a problem. But I think the main thing is, though, that there'd be many, many ways that people will be finding to be getting high from the whole different kind of society. And then we'll see in that context how important it is to them to do things like that as a way of finding a diversion. But that's not the kind of thing that we would be prohibiting. Our mission is not to keep people from having fun, especially in ways that don't do harm to other people. So one of the problems that we do have is, though, on the other hand, this is a serious business. Even while fun is a part of it, it's a part of the kind of world we want to build and the kind of movement we need to build. But also, this is serious business, and when they have laws against this, they can use those laws against people, especially people in the revolution. And if you're in the revolution and you're getting fucked up all the time, that's kind of a problem too. So we have to look at this in a balanced kind of way. But in the future, it'll be a different kind of deal. Won't have the same kind of laws, but also we have a lot of ways that people be inspired and get high in a natural kind of way. And then, like I said, we'll see what people want to do to relax and take off a little time from that in socialist society, which they... What was I saying again?
I mean, my question has to do, like, in the draft program, it makes a question around like strongholds in these certain areas, and so. Even you made that point in your speech, this necessity of having that. But my question has to do more with knowing that, and how given the voices of the people, it's always this question, right? It's like, I'm with y'all, I'm for y'all, but I got too much stuff to worry about. Such, it's all this one strike that's going on. If I get out there like that, or I'm just worrying about providing for my family. So while trying to build these strong, how do we answer some of those questions out there?
Why not?
That's a good question and a difficult question. I mean, I think people have had, a lot of experience working on this, and we have, to get more experience. But I think, one of the ways this works is that, okay, you brought up, for example, the thing about the one strike and the way that weighs on people. But on the other hand, when they do move to, let's say, throw somebody out on the basis of the one strike thing, and when people want to resist that and fight back against that, then I think it's very important to unite with them to do that. Both because it's important that they not get away with throwing out people on the basis of the one strike thing, and also because it sets a different kind of model and example for people in that area of the fact that we don't have to take this, and that we can, in fact, begin to fight back in a different way to deal with this. So, a lot of times we see this is a problem that we have generally in building a revolutionary movement. We see the need to do something, but the broader mass of people are not ready to take the steps to do it yet. This is a problem that, has existed in every revolution. Mao talked about this, when he was talking about the mass line. And what do you do in that kind of a situation? Well, one, you keep on propagating to people, you keep on putting forward to people, putting out to people what the real deal is and what does need to be done, and the fact that people do need to stand up and fight back against this. On the other hand, you can't just, on that basis, jump out there and say, let's do this when people aren't ready to do it. But what you can do is to try to apply the mass line, to figure out what they are ready to do, to figure out when and where they are ready to fight, to figure out when and where they do feel that they've had enough and they don't want to take this. And then you can unite with them to build a struggle and to build resistance against that. And then you try to deepen that as things develop over time. So this is one of the very difficult parts of this whole process is, you know, the way Mao said, sometimes there's a need to do something, but the masses aren't yet convinced of the need. So we can't force them to do things, even things that are in their interest, until they feel the need to do them. So we have to try to keep on convincing them of the need. And then where people do want to act, then it's very important we unite with them to act. And then it's very important that when they do act, we draw the lessons for them out of that and show them how it connects up to the whole system. Because this is a problem we do have. You know, if the people didn't have all the shit weighing on them, it'd be much easier to make revolution, but then, of course, we wouldn't actually need a revolution if people didn't have all the shit weighing on them. So that's kind of the contradiction that we're dealing with. And the very things that are the reasons why people do need a revolution, the irony here, to use that word again, is that the very things that people do suffer that make them need a revolution are also things that in the short run can hold them back from getting into the revolution. All the things you're talking about the need to try to feed their families and not get thrown out of their apartment, and they got a case against them, or they're on parole, and all the ways in which the system can jack them around and make them pay for fighting back. So they get you twice. They get you by oppressing you in the first place, and then they use the fact that they got a hold over you to keep you from fighting back. So these are the difficult contradictions of actually get down on the ground building the revolutionary movement. And it's a good question, but there isn't an easy answer to this other than to keep on applying the mass line. Other than keep on drawing out from people's comments and the way people respond to things, what it is they do see that's intolerable to them. What it is they do see that they don't want to put up with anymore. And when and where it is that they do feel the need and the urge to act and stand up, and then to unite with them to do that and keep on enabling them to see the larger picture. Because there is a connection there too. The more that people are their vision is narrowed down to the day-to-day struggle to survive, the harder for them it is to see why and how it's important to stand up and resist. On the other side of it, the more they see the larger picture, the more they see what's going on in society and the world as a whole, and how what's happening to them fits into that. And the more they see people in other parts of the society standing up and fighting back against various things, the more possible it is for them to see the reason, the need, and the possibility of fighting back against these things. So it's important to apply the mass line in that way, and it's important to keep on raising their revolutionary vision, keep on raising their sights of the larger things that are going on in society and the world, and how people are fighting back against that. And that gives them more of a sense that if they do step forward and fight back, they're not isolated, and that it's part of something bigger that's going to go somewhere, rather than just being crushed. This question is, ending the oppression of women is essential to the success of building the new society. But this whole culture is so gender oppositional and sexually objectified. What are the key steps we can take towards confronting and challenging and changing this situation? And what particular roles can we as politicized men play in leading other men towards a revolutionary understanding of women and how to stand fearlessly with them? Well, that's another good and very important question. It is true, ending the oppression of women is fundamental to the whole revolutionary process and to bring into being a whole new society. And it is also true, as pointed out in the question, that this culture, just contributes in 1,000 ways to the degradation and to the oppression of women. It's everywhere you turn, in every kind of thing. I mean, someone was telling me that, some of this shit they have of, women in the ads and all the way they use them to sell all these products is really equivalent. It's the same kind of thing as having constantly being confronted with pictures of black people eating watermelons and fried chicken. It's the same kind of degradation. And, we wouldn't put up with that. We don't put up with that, and we shouldn't put up with this either. So that's one very important thing. We have to call this out and make people aware of it. It's so thoroughly immersed, it's so constant and so much everywhere in the culture that people kind of become dead to it. They don't even think about it because it's just part of, what's there. And we have to make this jump out to people. That's what this person was raising when they were making this comparison. We got to make this jump out to people. What are they doing here? What is the image they're portraying? What kind of social relations does this help to, reinforce? So this is one thing. Exposure, this is very important. At the same time, it's also the same kind of principle that I was just talking about in terms of what he was asking about people, who in these strongholds who have all these things weighing on them. The important principle is that, like Mao said, wherever there is oppression, there is or there will be resistance. There is all kinds of resistance. People, in particular women, stepping forward to fight back against these things. Partly, resistance also gets developed when we do more exposure. Things that were tolerable to people or that they just figured they had to put up with become more intolerable, become things that they don't feel they have to put up with when they see them sharply exposed and put out in relationship to the whole society and how it's organized and how people are being oppressed and exploited in various ways. So exposure can actually help people say, I don't have to put up with this. Or even to say, I didn't see it that way. Both men, but also even women sometimes get worn down by this. And just get used to the fact, sometimes you hear them say, well, that's just the way men are. As if somehow we have to accommodate ourselves to that. As if somehow we have to, no. So we need to be exposing this sharply, also in order to bring forward women to oppose these things, but especially there needs to be, struggle among men about these questions. One of the things that, Marx and Engels pointed out in founding the communist movement is a big contradiction is that even the most exploited and oppressed proletarian man can act like a bourgeois in one place, in his home and in his family. And this is a big contradiction we have that has to be struggled out. At the same time, however, we can't lose sight of the larger picture and where this is coming from. If we make the target men instead of the system, we're going to mix up things and we're going to confuse what Mao talked about. We're going to confuse two different types of contradictions. The contradictions that are among the people, even when they're sharp, and the contradictions of a very different kind between the people and the enemy. It's the system that embodies and reinforces these relations of oppression, whatever kind we're talking about. And yes, it gets sections of the people to go along with this and to feel they have a stake in it. That's one of the things we have to struggle against and overcome. And we don't have to and shouldn't accept that. But we have to keep, once again, our eye on the prize and on the larger picture. And we have to bring people to an understanding of the all-around nature of the system as well as its nature in terms of these particular forms of oppression. So that people feel that these things are intolerable. When people rise up to struggle against something is when they begin to feel that these things are intolerable. And you've seen that over and over again. Most people don't see themselves as political activists most of the time in this kind of a society. I remember hearing an interesting story about someone who said, in relation to this whole thing with Iraq, well, usually I let the politicians, and she meant the regular, Democratic Party politicians, take care of things. But goddammit, they're not doing anything. They're not opposing this war that Bush is doing. So now we got to get out ourselves and do something. That's not what I like to think about doing, but now I find myself having to do it. Why? Because they feel it's intolerable. She feels it's intolerable and that nobody else is going to do this if she doesn't step forward and be part of it. And this is the way that we have to, when you bring people to an understanding that something is, first of all, as horrific as it is, and second of all, that it doesn't have to be, that's when people more feel like struggling against it. As long as people don't see how horrible it is, or even if they see it's horrible, as long as they don't understand that it could be some other way, they're not going to be as determined to jump out and struggle against it. So we have to be constantly exposing two things: the horrors of this and the fact that things don't have to be this way, and that people should not put up with these things. And then once again, we have to unite with people where they step out and where they give expression to the fact that they now feel these things are intolerable and they don't want to put up with them. And then we have to have friendly, yes, but very sharp struggle among the people, and in particular with men, over these questions, not to make them the enemy or the target, which is the system, but also to say, look, if we're going to get up and out of this, we have to throw off this burden that's on us. We have to throw off these ways in which the system is dragging us down in the mud. We have to throw off the ways in which it's getting one part of the people to join in the oppression of the other part of the people. One half of humanity can't be chained and humanity be free. So this is a very important thing we have to bring out very forcefully.
Bob, I'm glad you came here and talked, and I wanted to ask you, part of your earlier talk was about our involvement with Iraq, the slaughter of the poor Iraqis, and what do you think the odds are for election purposes this current administration will commit another slaughter against another country, one of the axis of evil? Most likely, I guess. That's it.
Well, I think it's possible that they would do that. It's not. Two things have to be said. They are not. On one level, they are madmen, but on another level, they aren't simply madmen, and they do try to think strategically, and they do have people smarter than Bush, I guess, which isn't saying very much, who actually try to think things out strategically. And think, over the longer term. And they, like a lot of people thought, well, as soon as they get through with Iraq, they're going to attack Iran and then North Korea. But they're actually proceeding in a little bit more measured way right now because they don't want to get overextended and they don't want to get in over their heads. I mean, North Korea is a real problem for them because whether or not it has nuclear weapons, it has massed artillery on the border with South Korea. And if they attack it, it can unleash a massive barrage which will kill, probably thousands of American soldiers and probably hundreds of thousands of South Koreans. So they have to figure out how to deal with that contradiction. They can't just jump in with both feet without thinking. And similarly with Iran, it's, to go after Iran is not just a light matter. It's even more complex and more difficult than going after Iraq, which they weakened through a previous war and then through 10 years and more of sanctions. So I think there's a possibility, but they are trying to think strategically even past the election. I actually think one of the main ways in which they're trying to position themselves for the election, interestingly enough, has to do with the state of California right now. I think not that I'm a fan of Gray Davis, or you want to argue for keeping him in office. On the one level, who gives a fuck, But on the other hand, we do have to look beyond the surface of things to see the larger picture. And I do think this whole thing with this recall is very likely part of the whole thing where these people are positioning themselves well beyond this immediate situation in California, trying to get control of the state of California as part of going for the 2004 election and looking beyond that. And I think one of the things we do have to think seriously, I mean, Bush has gone off and raised, what, $200 million already for the 2004 election. I mean, it's just really, incredible. And I think one of the things that it's very serious to consider is, these people are building, people grouped around Bush, and he's just a sort of a figurehead for this group of people. It's been at this for quite a while now. They actually consider any other group of people being the government of this society as being completely illegitimate. That's the way they looked at and treated Clinton. Again, he's no hero of the people by any means, but that's the way they looked at him even when he was president. And that's the way they look at anybody other than themselves as being at the core of power in this society. And I think there are some whether they go and attack another country, which I wouldn't rule out, there's some very serious things that are going on in this society now that we have to look at. We can't be simple-minded if we're going to actually do what needs to be done, especially if we're going to make the kind of revolution we need to make. You got to look at what's been building in this society for quite a while now. You know, you've got what I refer to sometimes is helpful to look at it kind of like a triangle or a pyramid. At the top of this pyramid is the people that rule a society. And in particular, you've got, you know, sort of like those that are represented by the Democratic Party on one hand and the Republican Party on the other hand. And there is struggle between them. I mean, this is very obvious, right? Think back to the 2000 election. That was the most boring election in recent memory. And all of a sudden it turned into an extremely intense and interesting thing. Not because of what they said and did while they were campaigning, but because of the way the election came out. Or didn't come out. So then what, you know, you could see there's very sharp struggle among them. And if you look at this kind of pyramid thing, at the top of this pyramid is the ruling class and these different political representatives, which you can, for maybe oversimplifying a little bit, refer to as Democrats and Republicans. And for decades now, these people, you know, who are grouped around Bush and the kind of people that they represent have been working and preparing a whole thing in society, a whole like infrastructure, you might call it, a whole structure within the society itself that could move the society in a whole different way toward a whole fascistic kind of thing when things come to that. You look at this whole religious fundamentalist thing they've got. This is an effort to deliberately build up a base of people, millions and millions and millions of people who are frightened by the idea of thinking. I'm serious. You know, who cannot deal with all the complicatedness, all the complexity of modern society, who want simple, absolute answers, you know, to the complexities of this society, to all the complications and complicatedness of this society. And, you know, they whip these people around, and the whole religious fundamentalist thing is based on, you know, like that bumper sticker, God said it, I believe it, and that settles it. And of course, what God said, quote unquote, as I said earlier, is you know, what these human authorities tell them God said. Not only on what's in the Bible, which was written by people, but also what these people alive today say the Bible means. And parts that they ignore in the Bible that are inconvenient to talk about now. Some of the things I was mentioning earlier. They don't really want to go out with a program saying all children who strike their parents should be executed. Because that would expose them for the crazy maniacs that they are. But if you literally believe what's in the Bible, you should uphold that. Okay, so now here's an example of how they get these people to be unthinking stormtroopers. They had a real problem with this Christian fundamentalist movement. Because for years and years and years, they've all been trained on the idea that Jews are the killers of Christ. That's how they've been identified, the Christ killers. This is how you learn if you learn fundamentalist religion. Jews are the ones who crucified Christ. And so naturally, this makes them, you know, like, you know, kind of be, crazy in their hatred for the Jews. But they got a problem. You see, the people who are on top of this, not the people who are unthinking, you know, foot soldiers of this, but the commanders on the top, the Falwells and the Pat Robertsons and all those people. Their problem is that they are strategic operatives for this imperialist system and for a particular section of the ruling class within it. And for this ruling class and for that section, the state of Israel is tremendously important strategically for everything they're trying to do in the world. So here you got a contradiction. The state of Israel is a Jewish state made up of Christ killers, and yet you've got to get people to be unthinkingly supportive of the state of Israel. How do you do that? Well, here's what you do. You tell people that according to the book of Revelation, no, this is what they do. According to the book of Revelation, the creation and existence of the state of Israel is a crucial step in the process leading directly to the second coming. So therefore, if Israel is destroyed, it will set back the forces of Christ and advance the forces of Satan in terms of the second coming. Therefore, the state of Israel has to be defended at all costs. Get it? So this is the way they get these people. Now, they've been working on this base of people for decades. They've been organizing them, not only creating this whole broad movement, they've also been organizing what you could call cadre formations, political structures and political operatives in things like the Promise Keepers. The Promise Keepers is a fascistic, fundamentalist religious organization which not only calls on men to make their wives subordinate to them and wives to submit to their husbands lovingly, but it also sets out to organize an actual structure of people who will carry this message and this program into every part of life, into their job, into their, little league baseball and all the rest of this. They've been building this up for decades now. So they've got a sort of a fascistic mass movement and an organized cadre they're building within the society, an organized structure of political operatives. And then no, not like us. and then they've got something even more important than that, although that's very important for them. They've got a heavy influence in the command structure of the American military. Like there's a book, for example, called Making the Corps that's written about the Marine Corps, and it takes a year in basic training of people in the Marine Corps. And one of the things that comes out in that book is that one of the big principles of the U.S. military has always been that it's not a political army. It's not a politicized force. It doesn't take part in politics. It upholds the chain of command through the Constitution, and it doesn't get involved in politics, and it doesn't have an ideological stand. But that over the last few decades, there's been an increasing influence of the Christian right-wing fundamentalists among the officer corps of the military. So that now it's a highly ideological military officer corps that identifies politically with this extreme right-wing fascistic kind of program and movement in the society. So look at this whole picture and look what they've been putting in place. And then think about this fact that what are the Democrats, from their own position within the ruling class, what do they have to counter this with? Here's your pyramid. Here are the Republicans up here with their shit going down to this right-wing social base of religious maniacs and fundamentalist fools. Okay, remember the aftermath of the 2000 election when they were dealing with all the hanging chads and pregnant chads and all the rest of that? All right, there was one point where in one precinct in Florida, they were counting the ballots. And this group of operatives, they were Republican congressional aides and stuff, came down there and banged on the doors of the precinct where they were doing this and actually intimidated them out of counting the ballots. Now, what's that symbolic of is something much bigger than that particular incident. What it's symbolic of is that these forces are quite willing to call into motion this fascistic kind of force that they've built up when they feel they need it, and they're willing to bring it all the way into motion and turn this into a whole other kind of religious, fundamentalist, fascistic society if they feel that's where they need to go. On the other hand, here you are, the Democrats on the top of this pyramid. Who are the people that you try to appeal to? Not that you represent their interests, but who are the people you try to appeal to on the base of the other side of this pyramid? All the people who stand for progressive kind of things, all the people who are oppressed on the society, that's who the Democrats, part of their role is to get all those people back into the bourgeois, the mainstream electoral process. Because those people are always alienated and angry at what happens with the elections for the reason I was talking about earlier. Those people always are betrayed by the Democratic Party, which talks about the little man and the poor people and the people who are discriminated against, and even they'll use the word oppression, but then they just sell them out every time because they don't represent their interests. But they have a certain role of always trying to get them back into the election. Come on in, it's not as bad as you think, you can vote, it's okay. This is the role they play. But the thing about them is they are very afraid of calling into the streets this base of people that they appeal to vote for them. the absolute last thing they want to do in the world is call this force of people into the streets to protest or even to battle against this right-wing force that's being built up. So this is a part of the real danger that exists now in this country, is that, and it's a very sharply contradictory and two-sided thing, though. We should understand that. On the one hand, things get moved further and further to the right, and all the Democrats do is raise a few whiny objections and then find their position at the left wing of the far-right thing that's moving farther and farther to the right. And they always present themselves as the reasonable center and as the ones upholding the Constitution and order and the order of society as it moves further and further in this fascistic kind of direction. But the other side of that is that as things are sharpening up in society, there are tens of millions of people who hate the direction that things are going in. We've seen this in the aftermath of the election, and we saw it around the Iraq War. It's not just the Iraq War, although it very definitely is that. That people have a deep, visceral gut hatred for everything that's represented by Bush and the whole direction they're taking things. And one of the interesting things that's happened is because of the role the Democrats are playing, they're paralyzed to a significant degree from offering any alternative to those people. Part of the reason why the demonstrations against the Iraq War were as massive as they were is because people felt they had no choice, because the Democrats refused to offer them an alternative. If you think back to the elections in 2002, the congressional elections, it was a perfect time when if a party like the Democrats actually wanted to oppose what Bush is doing and his whole move toward war, they could have got a massive turnout of people voting for them. People were almost begging them to take a stand against it. But for all the reasons, they look at the situation, they say, well, look, we may not like some of the Bush program either, but if the shit comes down and everything goes down and it's a struggle between us and them, they can call all their crazy people out in the street and they can get big sections of the military to go with them. Who's going to go with us that we aren't afraid to call out? So they're paralyzed, and this is one reason why there was tremendous mass mobilization, because people felt the need for something to be done. They were looking for people like the Democratic Party leaders to do something, and they didn't do it, and people felt strongly enough that they said, we have to move on our own anyway. Now, this is significant in itself, but it also has a positive potential in terms of revolution. Because this is exactly it. I'm not saying we're on the threshold of a revolution right now, but just looking down the road and looking at the potential. One of the things that leads to a revolutionary situation, as I was trying to talk about earlier, is that millions and millions of people feel that something is intolerable, they have to act on it, they want certain leaders at the top of society to lead them in doing it, but those leaders are not in a position to and don't want to lead them in doing it. So whom do they turn to? The people who are willing and determined to lead them to do it and to take it somewhere. So this is a situation that's full of great dangers. But the same situation, the other side of the contradiction, is that it holds out much positive potential for struggle now and for revolution as things unfold. Think about it now. Think how they run this game. You've got this whole traveling circus out here now of Democratic Party candidates going on this speaking tour around the country. And interestingly enough, there was this whole thing in Time magazine where they said, they were talking about Al Sharpton, and they're saying, well, the funny thing is that Al Sharpton is an illegitimate candidate. He has no chance of being president, and he has this whole funny past, Tawana Brawley case and all this stuff. But isn't it strange, they said, that when they have these candidates meetings, he's the only one that gets much of a response from people, other than this guy Howard Dean, because those are the only ones even pretending to talk about anything that people feel deeply in their gut these days. But whether someone like Sharpton is sincere or not, what's actually going on here is that they'll try to use something like the Sharpton campaign to get all those people who are alienated and angry and feel the Democrats have betrayed them, back into the arena. Come on back. It's the primaries are coming up. Vote for your candidate. There's a place for you. And then what happens? Your candidate doesn't win. He doesn't get the nomination. But then they got the next step for you. Now they got you leaning that way, and they say, but do you want Bush again? Okay, so your candidate didn't get in there. So we got Dickhead Gephardt. But still, it's better than Bush, isn't it? And then you're paralyzed because you've been brought back into their arena where you can't do anything effective. So this is going to be a tremendous tug and pull over where this huge body of people, literally already tens of millions of people who feel this deep gut hatred for what's going on, whether they're going to get brought back into the fold or whether they're going to get increasingly brought into resistance. Now that doesn't mean that the dividing line should be drawn or can be drawn over whether you vote or not in the next election. That would be foolish. Many, many, many people are going to vote for the Democrats who are also going to know that the Democrats aren't going to do shit and that we have to get out and do something, and we have to unite with them in that part of it and bring them forward, because it's going to be proven again and again that these Democrats don't represent any way to really stand up and fight against this stuff. So we have to develop a certain sophistication, a certain maturity, a certain flexibility, a certain all-aroundedness about how we approach these things, a certain dialectics of recognizing the contradictions and how they actually move and develop in order to actually build the kind of movement that can have a major impact now and can actually lead toward revolution.
Okay. Now my question is though, what made you not believe in God and why?
Well, actually, I was raised in a religious family, and you know, as a teenager, I you know, and up until the time I was a teenager, I did believe in God. That's the way I was raised. But I don't know if I can identify one particular thing, but just as, you know, as I learned more about the world, as I learned more about history, as I studied the history of like where these various religious texts came from, it became clear to me that these were things that had been invented by people to try to explain things that at the time they couldn't explain. And that these were not the inspired word of God, but what you know, represented what people, like I said, understood but also did not understand at the time. You know, there are many, many things that seem mysterious until they're explained. You know, for example, think of people in ancient societies, and they would see things like people having an epileptic fit. That's very scary if you don't know what that's about. You know, all you can imagine is maybe somebody's been, you know, inhabited by demons or something like that. Once we understood scientifically this has to do with things in the brain, then it's still a little upsetting, but you don't look at it the same way anymore. And there are many, many things like this that as I, you know, learned more about the world and learned about a method for understanding the world, it became clear to me that this was just things that people had made up. You know, that God hadn't created people. People had created God out of a need that they felt, or the idea of God. Now, it wasn't, you know, I quit believing in God long before I became a communist. And I'm trying to think back about what exactly it was that, you know, convinced me of this. I think it was partly what a lot of people go through is you see the, you know, the cruelty in the world. And you say, after a while, it gets hard to keep believing that old thing they say, this is all part of God's plan. You know, anything terrible happens, well, God will find a way. God must know why this is happening. Because after a while you start saying, if this is all part of God's plan, it's a pretty fucked up plan. and then you start questioning, you know, like, you know, and things really don't, you know, after a while they don't make any sense. You know, like in other words, let's say there is some kind of an earthquake and all these people die. Why would that be part of a plan of a God? What would God be up to with killing 20,000 or 50,000 people in an earthquake? It would be kind of a sadistic God. It would be kind of like, you know, the book of Job in the Bible. You know, Job has to go through Job is like, you know, he's the most loyal believer in God, he's the biggest suck-ass to God you could ever find. He's never sinned, he's never turned away from God, and yet, you know, God just puts him through all these tribulations. You know, he gets sores on his body, his wife leaves him. I mean, his life just goes from one misery to another. Why? What the fuck's wrong with this God, you know? Why you have to put people through all this kind of stuff, you know? So after a while, you start saying, well, this is not some plan of some God. This is just people's way of trying to explain why there's so much, why there's so many horrible things in the world. And they didn't have a real way of understanding it. So they invented this kind of a thought. And you know, some of these people may be sincere. I don't know. I wasn't there when some of these prophets like Jeremiah and these other people claimed to see visions and to hear God talking. I wasn't there when Muhammad said the angel Gabriel came down to him and told him what God wanted him to do. I know one thing. If you live out in these desert areas in the Middle East and you go a long time without food and water, you can believe all kinds of shit after a while. Seriously, you can have all kinds of hallucinations and believe that you're talking to all kinds of people. We've got these people around now, especially with all the cutbacks they let people out of the mental institutions. We got a lot of people wandering around now, believing they're talking to God. And we got people like the people in Waco, like David Koresh. He believed that he was talking to God. There's a lot of stuff like this, but unfortunately for them, they haven't got a mighty empire like the Roman Empire to adopt their ideas and force them on everybody. That's what happened with Christianity. It was a relatively marginalized religion, which was spreading a bit throughout that part of the world, the Middle East and all around the Mediterranean. But then in the 4th century, in the 300 and something, the emperor of Rome, Constantine, decided that Christianity was a useful tool for him in fighting to consolidate his rule over all of the Roman Empire and to unify that empire. So he went and told his troops one night before a big battle, I saw the sign of a cross in the sky, and it said, by this sign you shall conquer. Conveniently, that sign of a cross also looks like a sword if you handle it a certain way. So this is what Constantine told his troops, and this was the sign, quote unquote, under which he conquered. And so then he began to move toward making Christianity the dominant religion of the whole Roman Empire, which spread it to large parts of the world at the point of a sword. If it hadn't been for that, Christianity might have died out and we'd never even hear of the Bible. But because it served the rulers of the Roman Empire at a certain time, not only did it grow, but now it comes invested to us with the awe of majesty, of hundreds and thousands of years of tradition behind it. So it isn't like the Mormons. You say, oh, you just made that shit up. So all these things are things, that I've learned over a whole lifetime, but I guess the immediate thing was just seeing all, even before I became a communist, just seeing all this stuff going on and saying, this doesn't make any sense. And in fact, just a personal aspect of this, I remember one time when I was still going to church, but I was starting not to believe in God anymore. There was a time when there was a church service we had to go to where they said all the lay people, the people who weren't the preacher and everything, had to be part of the service. Somehow I ended up giving a prayer. So I wrote up this prayer and I got up and gave it, and afterward one of the people in the church came and said, that was the most beautiful and heartfelt prayer I've ever heard. And I said to myself, that's funny, I didn't believe a fucking word of it. So all these things go on, and you start to look around and you start to say, this can't be part of some plan of some supernatural being. This is people trying to understand the world at a time and in a way that they can't really understand it, or large parts of it. Because so much of the Bible is just wrong. I mean, the whole way it describes how the earth came into being is completely wrong and disproved by science many times over. It has the order of things all wrong. You know, it has like, the other animals coming after Adam and Eve, when in fact human beings evolved long after other animals. You know, it has certain people ruling at certain times in certain countries when it was their grandson that was actually sitting on the throne at that time. Now, maybe just, history isn't one of God's best subjects. But you would think that an all-seeing, all-knowing, all-powerful God could get it right about who's sitting on the throne in one country at what time. I was watching this videotape on Christianity, and this guy was making an interesting point. This is see, people sit there and they read their Bibles, but because it comes dressed in so much, Richard Pryor had this whole thing about how the Catholic Church said, man, I really like the Catholic Church because you go by there and they got all that mystery and a lot of it's in Latin, so you can't understand what they're saying, so it doesn't sound so bad. In fact, when they changed the liturgy in the Catholic Church to English, a lot of people got disoriented. Oh, that's what it's saying? This is a problem, but I forgot what the point I was making. But anyway, there a lot of this stuff, you read it and it just doesn't make sense. It is. Oh, I know the point I was making. I was watching this tape on Christianity. And here's the way they get people, like they're reading the Bible and they think it's this like word hand, and God said this and then Satan did that. If you were to walk around out there on the street and be talking about this Satan, and Satan did this and Satan did that, they come and take you away, You have to be in some kind of church setting or organized religious setting to get about talking about people doing things when they aren't even there. Bad enough to believe in God, but to believe in Satan. So anyway, people read all this stuff and they just it sounds like so mysterious and powerful to them, especially because you can't, if you read the King James version of the Bible, it was written 400 years ago, you can't even understand the English. So it sounds very mysterious. But this professor was giving a lecture, and here's something interesting, because it deals with this whole born-again thing. He was talking about a section of the Bible where Jesus is having a conversation with someone else, a local person in one of the villages in that area. And they're talking about what is necessary to get into the kingdom of heaven. And then they have this whole discussion where Jesus says, in order to get into the kingdom of heaven, you have to be born again. That's one English translation. But the other translation, taken from the Greek, is you have to be born from above. So in this section of the Bible, Jesus and this other person are going back and forth about which meaning is it in Greek. Is it the being born from above or being born again? And they go back and forth. And this professor pointed out there's only one problem with this. This particular part of the Bible was written in Greek, but Jesus and this peasant he's talking to, this villager he's talking to in a peasant area of that area, neither one of them would have spoken Greek. They would have spoken the Aramaic language that people in that area spoke. And in Greek, there's all this back and forth about born from above and born again. But in Aramaic, he pointed out, there's no such confusion. So the whole idea is just completely fabricated. In the real conversation they would have had, there would have been no confusion about whether you're talking about born again or born from above. But when it got written in Greek, they could have this whole play on words. The only problem is those two people would never have been speaking in Greek. So you see more and more things like this and you realize this is not some divinely handed down word. How could God get all these things wrong, and how could God not know the difference between Greek and Aramaic? Especially since it's supposed to be his son that's supposed to be speaking the language.
I just want to ask you, where were you, on the morning of 9/11, and, how did you find out about it? And, what was the very first thought to go through your head when you saw the two towers burning down?
Well, I'll answer the last part of that question only. And I can answer.
Fair enough.
I can answer it very simply. My thought were 2 words: oh shit. Here's a written question. How do we reach the proletariat and alert them of their oppression? Many may not be completely aware. Is the paper alone enough? And how is this being carried out now? Well, I think it's important the way this is put, because I think people may not be completely aware of their oppression, but they are aware of many different ways in which they're oppressed. I mean, people talk about this all the time, in many different ways. And you can't get a break out here. Every time I try to do something, they fuck me over, so on, so on, so on. You know, many different ways in which people talk about the ways that they're messed over. You know, it's true they don't have a full picture of it, and most importantly, they don't understand where it comes from and what it's all part of. So something like the newspaper, as I spoke to, is extremely important, both in exposing more of the features of this system and of the crimes it commits, and in putting this all together for people, enabling them to see the larger picture that it fits into. But it's true, on the other hand, as really important as the paper is, it isn't enough. Because people, as I was saying, learn more and are open to learning more when they do rise up to fight back and resist their oppression. And they do that all the time, in small ways and sometimes in bigger ways. It's true that people allow a lot of abuse and oppression to go on, figuring they have to put up with it until finally everything just kind of explodes. That's what the LA Rebellion was about, after all. Think about that. I mean, here, look at how that whole thing developed. Here was this Rodney King was beaten. Nothing unusual about that. The only perhaps unusual thing is he wasn't beaten to death. He managed to survive. But what happened that everybody thought made it completely different is somebody videotaped it. And what happened after that? All the youth were going around taunting the LAPD, saying, "You're going to beat me now? Because I'm going to get it on videotape." For once, they felt not just that they had right on their side, which they felt anyway, but that they had advantage on their side. They had something going for them, that these people have been caught. And everybody was feeling, now they got to believe us. We keep saying this and saying this and saying this is what happens, and they never believe us. But now they got to believe us. Look, we got them right on tape. You can't deny it now. And then they went to trial in Simi Valley, and the prosecutors once again did their non-prosecuting routine. And they had a jury that was set up the way they wanted it set up, so they came back with not guilty. And that was just too much to take. People said, we had all this proof. We let you go ahead with your trial because we knew we had you this time. And you still won't say it's wrong and won't punish these motherfuckers. So that's when people exploded. Now look at that. You know, this is not unique. This goes on all the time. But finally it becomes too much to bear. And this happens in big ways, but it also happens in little ways. You get tired of being shoved face down into the pavement. You get tired of somebody telling you that, you know, either by their words or just by the way they look at you, that you don't belong here. You get tired of being pulled over again and again and again because you're in the wrong neighborhood or just because they can do it to you. You get tired of trying to raise your kids on an income that comes nowhere close to being able to give them a decent life. You get tired of working your life away and being insulted every time, and then showing up one day at work and being told there is no more work. So when these things happen in little ways as well as in big explosions like the LA Rebellion, people do rise up and fight back. And when they do that, it's important that we be there to unite with them, to help them see this in the larger picture that it's part of, and to help them carry that struggle as far as they can at a given time. It's like I said, struggles big or small don't go forward in a straight upward line. They go in waves and then they crest. And then another wave comes forward. And it's important that we gain as much as we can gain looking toward revolution from each crest, from each uprising, big or small, that we make further advances in terms of people's understanding, in terms of their ability and their willingness to stand up and fight back, and in terms of people who actually come to a revolutionary understanding and become part of the revolutionary communist vanguard.
You've actually answered most of my questions, but I just wondered, it's been over 20 years since you've been here, and is the fact that you're here an indicator of what's going on in the world, or is there another reason why you felt like you can come back and speak to us in a more safe way, or is it more of a political question about the timing of what's going on right now in the world? And also, I noticed that you didn't really talk about 9/11 much at all in your speech as sort of like a watershed moment, which a lot of people are saying now, that's sort of what changed things in the last couple of years.
Well, the first part of your question, it's better just to let that particular question go and let things unfold as they do. But as to the second part of your question, I think what I was trying to speak to and talking a number of times about this juggernaut has to do very much with 9/11. But the point is, and I think it's very important to understand this, this is not something, and most people, of course, do not understand this and are being deliberately misled and confused about it. This whole juggernaut, this whole rolling monster of war and repression is not something that's being done in response to 9/11. This was something they had in motion long before 9/11. And you can look at, position papers that were being written in these right-wing foundations and stuff, all during the 90s, putting forward this whole strategic approach that they're now implementing, including the need to unseat Saddam Hussein through war on Iraq. That was in the works long before, even before Bush became president. Probably even before they knew whether it was going to be Bush or somebody else they were going to put forward to be the figurehead to implement this program. And 9/11 is I think we should understand it as a watershed, but in a different way than they present it. And I think that is an important point and an important question, to be serious here. It is, in a way, it could be compared to Pearl Harbor. When Pearl Harbor happened, the President of the United States at that time, Roosevelt, was able to immediately silence opposition and even within the ruling class, and mobilize the country to go to war. But the fact is, he didn't take the country to war because of Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor was the excuse and the rallying cry with which he took the country to war that he was planning to take them into anyway. And it's been shown that, for example, there's a book by this guy Stinnett which documents very extensively the fact that Roosevelt knew very well that the attack on Pearl Harbor was coming, and that he deliberately set it up so that they would not try to stop this attack, because he needed it. Because he knew that that would be the only kind of thing that could convince people to unquestioningly go along with getting into this war when there was a lot of opposition to it for various reasons, not always the best reasons. And not only that, but in this book, this Stinnett documents the fact that not only did Roosevelt know that the attack on Pearl Harbor was coming, because they had actually decoded the messages of the Japanese Navy and knew exactly what they were talking about, but also that a year before that, Roosevelt had adopted a policy, a program that was deliberately set up to provoke Japan into attacking the U.S., to actually move in a certain way that Japan would really have no choice but to start war with the U.S. Because Roosevelt needed that in order to go to war to accomplish the aims that U.S. imperialism had at that time, which was to contend with other imperialist powers and to try to gobble up the colonies and what they call spheres of influence of a lot of these other powers in Asia and other parts of the world. And I think there is a direct comparison here to what happened with 9/11. I don't know what Bush and them knew about what was coming on 9/11. Whether they actually knew the whole deal, maybe not. But it seems pretty clear that they had a pretty good sense that something was coming, some kind of an attack. Maybe they were surprised by exactly what it was and the actual damage that it did. But it's very clear that they knew something like this was coming. And just as, you know, in response to the earlier question, I said my response when this happened was, oh shit. The response of Bush and them was, oh good. Because this put them in a position, after all, they don't give a damn about these people that were killed. Think about what these people are and what they've done to people, including in this country as well as all over the world. They don't care about those 3,000 people or whatever. What they cared about is getting a political climate in which they could take this program that they'd been preparing for many years and really run with it and ram it down people's throats and try to run over any opposition. And I'm sure when people think about the fact, oh, we didn't stop the war. Okay, so we had this big movement. We didn't stop the war. Step back and think for a minute about how you would feel. I mean, I know this is hard to think about, but how you would feel if you were Bush and them. They never expected to have this massive outpouring of opposition around this war in Iraq. They felt like after 9/11, nobody would be mobilized. Nobody would dare come out and oppose them like this. And it's important to keep things in perspective. You know, sometimes when you get disappointed at the outcome of something, you kind of get a little bit distorted in your view and you forget the larger picture, the larger perspective it fits into. Let's get at this by posing a question. All the people who say, well, what did that all accomplish anyway when the war went ahead? If we had gone to them, let's say in April of 2002, and said, okay, here's the deal. They're going to go to war in Iraq and they're going to win that war and occupy Iraq in about a month in the spring of next year, 2003. But before that, there's going to be a demonstration of tens of thousands of people in Central Park against it. There's going to be a demonstration of hundreds of thousands of people in cities across the country soon after that. There are going to be demonstrations of 1 million and more people in the U.S. in the middle of February against this war, and tens of millions of people around the world. Would you take it? How would you feel about that? He said, no, you're kidding. That can't happen. So sometimes people lose perspective. You get disappointed at the way it finally came out. So you forget about the significance of everything that happened that was way beyond, I think, honestly and realistically, anybody's expectations of what would develop, even our own. So it's important to keep things like that in perspective and not to allow the twist on something at a given point to cause you to lose the larger picture and to see the potential that's come forward.
Bueno, son dos cosas en relación a al movimiento, a los movimientos reivindicativos, ¿no? Como la lucha contra la guerra o contra la brutalidad policial.
So I have two questions regarding the different struggles out there, like the struggle against the war, the struggle against police brutality.
Y en relación a la vanguardia revolucionaria.
And in relation to the vanguard leadership.
Okay. Primero es, por ejemplo, vemos que no son muchos, no por miles y miles los inmigrantes, no, de México, de Centroamérica, que participaron en esto contra la guerra, no, en las manifestaciones y todo, porque. Okay.
¿Qué dices, que no habían muchos? ¿O no?
Sí, pues tantos como la mayoría de la gente, no, de clase media y todo.
So
pues,
we didn't see a lot of different immigrants from different parts of the world that are here that actually took part in some of these struggles.
Okay, pues yo entiendo que la gente sí tiene interés en esto de la guerra, pero tiene también muchas necesidades.
I know they're very interested in what's going on against the war, but I also know they have a lot of interest in they have a lot of things to take care of, like they have to work and.
Ajá, la gente no se puede salir, ¿no?, del trabajo para irse a las manifestaciones.
People can't get out of work to go to all the demonstrations.
Ok, pero el punto es que ¿cuándo es que la necesidad por transformar el mundo, luchar por eso, va a ser mayor que la necesidad de las necesidades diarias, cotidianas que tiene la gente?
When is the transformation going to happen when the fight for a different world and a different future becomes principle as opposed to like fighting for everyday like needs that people have?
Si tenemos que esperar a que eso venga solito, o si el papel de la vanguardia revolucionaria, si la vanguardia revolucionaria tiene un papel importante que jugar en eso.
Do we have to wait for that to happen, or do actually the vanguard leadership actually has a role in playing and bringing that into being?
Ok, esa es una.
That's one question.
Y en relación a eso, rapidito, en relación a eso, o sea, cómo hacer también que la vanguardia revolucionaria, cuando se mete en este movimiento, ¿no?, contra la guerra y todo, no lo absorba, ¿no?, sino sin perder su dirección en el camino de revolución.
Okay, the second question is, how does, like, when the Vanguard Party is part of all these movements against the war and against police brutality and everything else, how does it happen that you don't actually lose your like aim of revolution and stuff, and you don't, the Vanguard doesn't just get absorbed in all these different like struggles and movements and stuff, and you keep on the correct road to revolution?
Okay, well, those are two very good questions. On the first one, I think it's a combination of both things. That is, the changing of conditions that people face and the changing of things going on in society as a whole has a great deal to do with bringing people into motion and around the larger struggles. At the same time, the party, the Vanguard, does have a great deal of work to do to also bring people forward more consciously in these struggles, and can't simply wait. We can't simply wait for the changes in conditions and the changes in what's happening in society and the world to bring people forward all on their own without our working to organize and lead them to see the need to act and to enable them to act around these things. And part of your question, it goes back to what several people have raised, that people are weighed down day to day by all the many things they do just to try to survive. And this makes it more difficult for them to come out into motion and even come to the forefront of these struggles, like the struggle against the war. It's difficult for them, giving the weight of everything, of trying to feed their children and trying to live from day to day and week to week, and all the hardships they have to go through. And we see that in a lot of these mass movements of, like, for example, against the war, a lot of the people who have been most active, not only, but a lot of the people have been people who were students or people in other positions where they have a little bit more ability to come out and do these things, where they have a little bit more freedom. And we shouldn't resent that, obviously. We should be very glad for it. We should be very, encouraged by the fact that they're doing that. And in fact, this creates more favorable conditions for people who are weighed down by all these things day to day to be able to step out, because it creates a climate and an atmosphere in society where people feel they can come out and be part of something much bigger, and even in a sense where they won't be so easily identified and picked out and picked off for stepping out in these conditions. So there's important back and forth there, but we can't simply, again, just rely on the larger things happening to just bring people out by itself. The Vanguard has a lot of work to do to make people see the need, the importance, and the possibility of acting, and also organizing people to be able to act and to be able to defend themselves when they're attacked for stepping out and acting in a political way like this. So I think it's a responsibility of the Vanguard to maximize, to make the most gains out of what a changing situation makes possible. Our role can't be to just passively tail after and watch what happens because of larger things happening. Our role has to be to try to go to the front of that and bring forward the most that we possibly can out of all that at each point and through each wave of the struggle. So I think that that's an important thing that the Vanguard, important responsibility we have to take on, And it includes getting together with people and figuring out how they can act in a way that doesn't just leave them open to being crushed. And how they can act in a way that also, makes possible dealing with their day-to-day needs. We have to build a kind of a movement that takes care of the day-to-day needs of people as they do step out. Now, we can't do that in any kind of fundamental way without a revolution. If we could do that within this society, we wouldn't need a revolution. Well, maybe we just need one for the people in the rest of the world, but not here, which would be reason enough to make a revolution anyway. But the fact is, we cannot deal with these things completely. But that doesn't mean we can't do anything under this, even while we're under this system. We have to find a ways, developing cooperative ways of developing child care, for example, for people who want to become active. And yes, we have to involve the men as well as the women in this child care. We have to struggle while we're taking on the big enemy and the real enemy. We also have to struggle at the way the enemy exerts influence within our ranks, the way in which men tell their wives not to get involved. That's not their role. Their role is to take care of the home. Where's my dinner? We have to struggle against all these kind of things. We also have to help people solve the practical problems that make it more difficult for them to step out. So that's an answer to part, at least in part to your first question. Oh yeah, that's also a very important question. How is it that in the midst of building all these struggles, we don't get lost in them? We don't lower our sights in the midst of them and lose sight of the larger thing that's necessary in order to finally put an end to all this? Well, I think, there's always that pull when you get involved in something to kind of narrow your sights and get totally absorbed in that particular thing, because it does demand a lot of attention. And there's also a pull to do that because you're in a course of any struggle, you're uniting with many other people. Many of them don't see or agree with the need for revolution. So there kind of gets to be a pull on you not to bring that kind of revolution stuff up and disrupt the unity that you're building with other people. This happens all the time, as we're all very familiar, I'm sure. But the fact is, the more that we actually bring out what we call our independent line of the party, the more we bring out our understanding of the need for revolution and the whole larger picture, the more we're able to create and then to recreate higher and higher levels of unity with people. It doesn't mean they come to agree with us right away about revolution. But when we put out the larger picture, even if they don't agree with us about all of it, they do see things in a larger perspective. They do see more how different things fit together and what this is all part of. And therefore, they do see more basis to unite with us, even while they still may disagree with us about revolution. And people have a way of finding their own level in relation to things. They say, well, I really like you, but, I don't understand why you're into all this crazy revolution stuff. You people are really good. If you just weren't communists, it'd be great. So, these are all the kind of things we have to work with. This is another contradiction we have to work with. We have to help them see, well, look, actually, it's because we're communists that we are great. It's because we are communists that we are fighting to liberate people, and because we do see the larger picture, that we are able to do the things that you see that are important and that you really think need to be done and that we're doing in a good way. Of course, they may not agree with that either at a given point, but they can respect that, and they can find their own way of finding their own level of unity with that. So it's important, even in terms of actually building a higher level of unity with people and maintaining it, to bring this out more fully. But more fundamentally than that, if we don't bring forward and if we don't build and move as far as we can, as fast as we can toward revolution, then what's the point after all? These struggles around particular things are very important. But these things that we're struggling against and resisting are not new. They've happened over and over and over again. Generations have struggled against these things. Many generations before us, and we don't want a situation where generations after us have to keep repeating just the same struggles in the same place. if you want to, like I said, really get rid of all these horrors that are going on and people are subjected to, you have to get to the root of it. And if we lose sight of that, then we've forgotten the whole reason we're here in the first place. Fundamentally, people can organize resistance without us. Not as well, not as deep. It won't be as deep, it won't be as broad. But they can organize and have organized, many great outpourings of resistance. We're not the only ones that can do that, and we shouldn't forget that. We can learn a lot from other people in terms of how they actually build resistance and the ways in which they struggle heroically and with creativity. But what they can't do without a vanguard is see the whole picture and get to the root of this and uproot it. And so we have to be constantly guided by that. When our heads get pulled down into the immediate struggle, we have to exercise our muscles and raise our heads back up. And keep remembering what this is all part of and where it all has to go if we finally want to end this long nightmare.
We're going to take one final question.
Where I live, there's a number of native peoples, and I'm talking with them about communism, about the draft program or whatever. One of the common things that I get in response is something along the lines of, okay, that's just another Western ideology. It's just another European thing that's going to be imposed on us. It's in conflict with our culture and our traditions and our beliefs. And it's not something that could help us. It's just going to be another, European imposition. And I was wondering if you could speak to that question.
Well, I think, this is something that also is contradictory, and we have to understand the contradictions involved in it. In other words, people have had the experience of having things shoved down their throats, and people have had the experience of having their culture attacked and declared to be, worthless. They have had the experience of needing to cling to that culture in order to survive as a people and so on. So we have to understand that on the one side. On the other side of it, though, communism is not a European ideology. It's not an Asian ideology. It's not an African ideology. It's not a North American ideology. It's a scientific ideology that explains the way the world actually is. If people disagree with our explanations of how the world is, then they should show us how our explanation is wrong. Just saying that this is an ideology that comes from somewhere else doesn't answer the question of whether what we're saying and our understanding of the world is true or not. I mean, one thing we could say is that Mao Zedong, for example, was not a European. And he did get the ideology from Marx and from Lenin, but he also took it and developed it further, and this led to the liberation of 1 billion people. So it was very relevant to their experience, and they had a very different culture than Europe too. But the fundamental truths and the fundamental method that this ideology brings could be applied there in that struggle, just as it could in struggles in Europe and just as it could in struggles in other parts of the world. It is being applied in other parts of the world. The Nepalese people, are being led by a Maoist vanguard to apply this ideology. And it's leading in the direction of their liberation after, long years, decades, and generations of seemingly endless oppression. This ideology is like a light, and it is like a tool to finally understand and make sense out of the world. And this is another example also of the embraces but does not replace point. Our ideology enables us to understand the experience of every people in the world and how it all fits together. But you do have to actually get down concretely and learn about people and learn from people and understand what they've actually been through and how they see things as a result of that. And you do have to, learn from them at the same time as you may disagree and express disagreement and struggle over certain things. It's not unique, though, to native peoples here. This is. I mean, if you go back in history, for example, once again, I'm on my Jones here about the Bible. But once again, the Bible is just also another creation myth and unifying myth of a certain tribe of people especially the Old Testament of the Bible, a certain tribe of people in their formative period several thousand years ago. And, you know, the communist outlook and method enables us to understand that and to put that experience in its historical context and perspective. And it can also enable us to understand other peoples and their experience and the myths they've developed to unify and to fight for their survival in certain circumstances. The most important thing is that in order for people to come to embrace and take up something, they have to learn partly by being struggled with, but also from their own experience. And as the burden of oppression that people suffered under is lifted, then people don't feel in quite the same way the need to cling to certain things that they felt the need to hold on to firmly while they were constantly under threat and under attack. As we make a whole change in society, including in the life and the situation of various native peoples, this will change their conditions, but also open up new ideas and struggle over ideas. Now, there is a question, however, of the advanced people among the native peoples now. We can't just wait for the future to try to win some people to communism. So we do need to get down and struggle with people. We need to struggle over, look, let's discuss and let's debate and let's get into struggle over the way the world really is and how it's developed. Now, not everybody's going to embrace that. They're going to say that's just your truth and not my truth, and if I embrace that, I have to give up my whole way of life. And as I said, you cannot force people to do that. But everybody's not the same either among any people. Everybody doesn't have exactly the same viewpoint on all this. There are people with a different perspective, different viewpoints on this, people who've had different experiences. Now, if people feel that you're coming to them and trying to shove it down their throat, rather than actually engaging with them about what is the real situation and what really does need to be done in the world, then of course they're going to resist it. And of course they're going to want to reject it out of hand. So we have to have a correct approach to people. We have to learn from what they do know, what their experience has taught them that does actually reveal important truths. But we also have to struggle with them about the larger way to understand things. And I don't think that we should have an attitude, and I know you're not saying that, but we should have an attitude that certain peoples and some kinds of people are capable of taking up a scientific understanding of the world and a revolutionary ideology, but some other peoples are just not capable of doing that. I think we have to recognize that truth is truth. Reality is reality. What is truth? Truth is a correct reflection of objective reality, or it's as close as you can get to a correct reflection of objective reality. That's what truth is. It's not my idea that I'm going to shove down your throat, or your idea that you want to act on because you like it better. It's what has actually happened and has happened in the world, and how do we understand that in relationship to everything else that we can see and observe and analyze. And so I think these discussions have to be held not in an arrogant way with people, and I'm sure you haven't been doing that, but in a way of actually discussing, okay, what is the actual history of your people? How did it change? I mean, for example, different native peoples have had different traditions at different times. For example, some of the Indians who were Plains Indians were not always people who lived on the plains by hunting. They had another kind of life before that, and they've developed myths and stories about where they came from and how their life changed. But there is a history there, and they used to have a different set of beliefs in a different set of circumstances. So they themselves have changed their beliefs as their circumstances have changed. And so we can get into this and discuss this with people as well. And I think really fundamentally we have to say this is very relevant for you. Look at the long history of genocide and oppression, and look what it's led to. And this is the ideology, and the movement and the struggle based on this ideology is the way that this can be finally ended, and a situation can be created in which the large numbers of people, of the native peoples, can actually decide for themselves how they want to view the world and how they want to be part of changing it, instead of having their circumstances imposed on them, not by us, but by this oppressive monster of capitalism and imperialism. So I think we have to very, patiently struggle with people in a good way, learning from them while we're also struggling, about how this not only applies in a general sense, but is fundamental to getting out of this whole situation that they've been cast into by this whole system. And I think that's the fundamental thing we have to keep pursuing with people, and not everyone's going to agree with that, many won't, but some of the more advanced people who are more open to these ideas can come to be, to embrace them and to take them up, if we struggle in a good way with them in the context of their own experience and the larger experience of what's going on in the world. The first question is, what is your thinking on reparations for the descendants of Africans formerly enslaved in the U.S.? Well, this is a question that has a lot of different parts to it. So I want to try to speak to different parts of it. I think that if you want to put it that way, as a moral question, there's absolutely no question, can be no debate about the fact that people are deserving of reparations. The question is, what's the best way to make up for these crimes that were committed and the damage that was done by this? There is a great deal left over from history in this and in other areas, but speaking specifically of slavery and all the oppression since slavery, that will have to be overcome in the process of making revolution in the new society. It will have to be overcome, and it will be overcome. Now, as far as the specific demand for reparations, let's start with that first. I think in a way the most important part of that demand is that it raises and shines a spotlight on all this horrendous oppression that the rulers of this country continually try to sweep under the rug and deny that happened or say that it no longer has any meaning and importance. So to raise that demand is very, very, very important even in that way, to expose the crimes they've committed and the legacy of those crimes, and not just the legacy, but the continuation of those crimes in the forms in which they're carried out today. So in that sense, even just in that way, raising the demand for reparations is very important. At the same time, you do get into some complications if you think about how under this system reparations would actually be paid. To whom would they be paid, and in what form? Are they going to be paid out individually to each descendant of Africans formerly enslaved in the U.S.? And if so, how is the amount for each individual to be determined? And what's going to happen with that money? Because frankly, no matter how much they paid, first of all, they could never really pay for what they've done in that form. But at the same time, on the other side, what they pay, if you spread it out among millions and tens of millions of people, which is what we're talking about, even if they paid billions of dollars, if it just goes to individual income to individuals, it's not going to mean that much, frankly. So how are you going to set up some way to take this money? What is a way that it can be used for the common good of the people who suffered this way? Is there a form in which some sort of community organizations can be set up, or some means whereby this could be used for the needs of the people broadly, rather than frankly being distributed among individuals and really not amounting to that much? So that'd be a question you'd have to take up. Now again, that's not a reason not to raise the demand or not to fight for the demand, but it does point to the fact that really overcoming this whole legacy requires revolution and requires going at this a whole different way with a new society. As I said, there's much that has to be overcome, and it will be overcome. One of the ways in which this will be overcome, for example, with regard to black people, is that there's a whole question of the right to self-determination, which is in our party's program. This means, given the whole history of the development of black people as a nation within the United States, centered in the South, where the plantation system was, what's sometimes called the Black Belt, which has to do actually with the color of the soil in the South, where the plantation system was centered. There is there is a whole historical basis which establishes the right of black people in this country to have self-determination in that territory. That is, to actually secede, to withdraw from the larger country, and to set up their own country if they so desire. So this is one question that has to be upheld and taken into account and applied in the new society once the old system is overthrown, because this will not really be possible within the confines of this system. Any kind of a self-determination, so-called, that would be exercised in that form under this system would be nothing but another neo-colony controlled by the imperialists, because they would never allow any kind of independent state of the formerly oppressed slaves and black people in general to be established right within the confines of the territory that they claim is their own. So this is one important principle that will be upheld. Whether or not this is something that would actually be in the concrete interests of the masses of black people, to actually secede and withdraw from the larger country once you have a socialist country and form a separate state, is something that would have to be determined concretely at the time. Now, the way we put it in our program is we uphold the right to do this, but we do not favor it under present conditions and conditions we foresee, because we think it's in the best interest of the masses of people overall, including the masses of black people, to have the largest and most powerful possible socialist state in the largest territory. But it's one thing to say you don't think something should be done under the conditions you can foresee, and it's another thing to say there are no conditions under which it would be a good thing to do that, which we don't say, and which would be wrong to say. And it's another thing still to say that people don't have a right to do that. You can uphold the right to do something while saying that in your opinion it's not the right thing to do at a given time. For example, the right to divorce. You can say that the right to divorce is important, especially for women who are oppressed in these kind of relations. But that doesn't mean that you think every woman who's married should get a divorce. It depends concretely on the nature of the relationship and in the conditions they find themselves in. But the important thing is upholding the right to do this. And what does that mean? It means, as you make revolution, that unlike under the present system, this question cannot be and will not be settled by force. That is, it will not be a matter of forcibly keeping people within the confines even of a new socialist state if they want to exercise the right to self-determination and withdraw from that state. You can argue with people that this is not the right thing to do, that it would be better to stay in the same socialist state and struggle things out in that confines because we'd be more powerful and would serve the interests of the people better. And it does serve the interests of the people better to have a larger socialist state, a more powerful socialist state. You can achieve more things both economically and also in terms of defending yourself. But it's one thing to make that argument, and it's another thing to say, but if you don't agree with me, I'm going to force you to stay here. Then you're not upholding the right to self-determination. What we mean by upholding the right is that this question will be settled by the black masses themselves without the use of force by the socialist state itself, on the basis of what the masses of people themselves, in this particular case the masses of black people, determine to be what they want to do and what's in their best interests. And the exact forms of that will have to be worked out as the revolution advances and seizes and consolidates power. But this is the principle that has to be upheld. But even if the expressed will of the masses of black people is to stay within the larger socialist state, there's still the question for them, and there's also the question for other nationalities oppressed under this system, of having the right to autonomy within that larger socialist state, in significant areas within that larger socialist state. There's still the question of being able to exercise, in other words, local self-government within the larger framework of the overall government if people decide to remain a part of that, and according to the general principles of the new socialist state. And what this means is in things like areas of culture and language, customs, and so on, these will be respected and upheld in accordance with the history of different peoples within what is now the United States. In the new socialist society, this will be respected and upheld, and people will be able to exercise local self-government in large or significant territories where they've historically lived or where they're presently constituted in large numbers. In rural areas, but also in urban areas. And it means that in the affairs of those local areas, They themselves will determine policy on all the different questions of education and other things and culture and so on within the larger framework of the existence and the principles governing the socialist state as a whole. And this has to be applied not only with regard to black people, but with regard to all the different nationalities, Chicanos and others who've been oppressed also under the system, who suffered national oppression and been the victims of racism. So this is the main way that we will set out to address this question in the future socialist society. And this will not be like what this ruling system has done with the reservations, for example, of the Native Americans at this time, which is they stick them on the worst land that's not productive, or they move them once they find out there's something valuable under the land, which they keep on doing. They find uranium in the Southwest and they say, whoop, time for you to move and get somewhere else. We need the uranium. And they give no resources and no real assistance to these areas to develop autonomously or in any way. So that you see there are tremendous levels of unemployment, of poverty, of alcoholism and disease on these reservations. This is not what we're talking about with autonomous areas of self-government and socialist society. We're talking about giving special aid and additional resources to be used by these local self-governments to develop their areas and to raise the standards of the people in an all-around way. We're talking about priorities of the society being devoted to overcoming rather than to reinforcing or perpetuating the inequalities that this system has brought about. We're talking about, as we call it in our program, raising the bottom up first, so that throughout the inner cities and wherever people of the oppressed nationalities are concentrated, special attention and special resources will be devoted by the state to overcoming the inequalities, to raising up these areas that have been held down in the most depressed and oppressed conditions under this system. And of course this will be a struggle. It'll be a struggle not just because there's a lot of racism in the society, which there is and there will be even after the revolution succeeds, but also because there are going to be real pressing needs, needs that many people are going to face. I mean, let's get real about what a revolution is going to involve. It's not going to involve the ruling class saying, okay, we give up, we quit, we're tired, you can have it. It's going to be a most wrenching struggle involving a tremendous amount of sacrifice and, yes, destruction. And we're going to have to rebuild on the basis of that destruction that's been created through the whole struggle to wrench power from them. And we're going to have to do it in a new and completely different way. We're not going to continue having a society that lives by sucking the blood like a parasite out of people all over the world. We're not going to live by exploiting the world in order that we can have a higher standard of living here. So if you think about all those things, there are going to be a lot of challenges and problems. A lot of things people take for granted now are not going to automatically and necessarily be there in the very first stages of socialism, when we're consolidating and beginning to rebuild. It's going to be like Lance Armstrong with cancer. We're going to have to rehabilitate. There's going to be a lot more poverty than there is right now through the course of all this. But the point is we'll have the basis to overcome that and overcome it much more quickly than even can be envisioned now. So we'll be starting from that, and there'll be a lot of struggle. A lot of people will have a lot of very pressing needs. Not a need for a third car, but a need for health care, a need for food, a need for basic things that people need. And we'll have to be producing this ourselves. See, that's the difference about socialism. You're not doing it by living off the backs of other people, but you're also not doing it under the command and by the organization of other people. All of a sudden, it's on all of us. All the things that have to get done, we have to do. All the things that have to get planned, we have to plan. All the things that have to get organized, we have to organize. And we can't, in a certain way, say, oh, the fucking bourgeoisie, look what they did, because we'll be running everything. So it'll be up to us to figure out how to overcome all these things we'll be facing at that point. So in this context, you can see there's going to be a lot of struggle. Not just because of backward ideas and racism and so on, but because there'll be real pressing needs pulling in different directions. But at the same time, and this is why we don't write things in our program just because they sound good. We write things in our program, we put forward things in our newspaper because this is what we believe needs to be done, and also because this is how we want the masses of people increasingly to look at and to see what we're talking about. And yes, to hold us accountable to those things. To say, but this is what you said you were going to do in your program. How come it's not happening this way? We want that. Now sometimes we'll have to explain, well, because some things arose that we didn't anticipate. But you can't say that every time. So we're going to have to follow those principles, and that's why we're putting them out there. Not just to put out a plan and a guideline, but also to say to people and to create public opinion, this is what should be done, and judge things by this. And one of the principles we're putting out now to train people, including, yes, white people, is that we are going to have to give special attention, yes, a kind of revolutionary affirmative action, to overcome this whole legacy of oppression. We're going to have to do real reparations in that sense, or else we're never going to have the kind of society and the kind of future we're talking about. If we just reproduce the same inequalities, and even if we do that in the name of saying, well, everybody's equal now, so nobody needs special attention, that's just another way of reproducing the same inequalities. And if we do that, then we betrayed everything we're talking about. So that's not what we're going to do. We're going to put this out now, we're going to train people, and we're going to struggle. And when the new society is brought into being, we're going to lead that struggle to enable people to correctly handle the balance between paying special attention and devoting special resources to revolutionary reparations, if you want to put it that way, while at the same time balancing that with meeting the overall needs of the masses of people as a whole. And this is how, in a revolutionary way, this question can and must be and will be addressed. At the same time, once again, raising this demand even now under this system for reparations is a real blow against this whole ruling class. It's certainly something that's deserved, and it's something that is important to be raised, and we support it in that way. Another question is, will you please share your thoughts on breaking down borders under socialism? Both when imperialist or capitalist states exist and when the whole world is socialist and not yet communist. Will there be regional socialist states, for example, North and or Central America? Former imperialist countries, for example, the USA and the European Union countries. Will there be regional socialist states in these areas to more quickly overcome the lopsidedness in the world? Well, that's a very good and a very provocative question, and thought-provoking question. One of the things I thought was very interesting is that the party in Nepal has put forward the idea and begun popularizing the idea that even as their revolution is going forward and coming to the threshold of and confronting the really complicated and difficult questions of whether and when and how to take power throughout the country, they're popularizing the idea of having a federation of revolutionary, of socialist states eventually developed throughout South Asia, including India. And I think they're doing that because they're trying to anticipate how the imperialists are going to respond, in particular if they do seize power in that country, and more generally, for example, how they're going to try to mobilize the army of India, which probably will be the main and most immediate way they intervene to try to drown that revolution in blood there. It's very interesting. I heard something to the effect that in recent weeks or months, they've made a change so that the uniforms of the army of the old system in Nepal are now indistinguishable from, look exactly the same as the uniforms of the Indian army. Now, why do you think they're doing that? Obviously, so they can send in the Indian army and claim they haven't sent it in. So this question of a federation of socialist states in that area is both something to try to deal with that very real and very imminent direct threat, but it's also a more strategic vision of not just trying to have socialism in the one country, but trying to build a socialist federation. Again, it goes back to what I was saying in response to the previous question. Because despite the national differences between the people, the larger your socialist territory and your socialist state and your socialist economy is, the more powerful it is, the better it serves the interests of all the people in that area. The better it serves their basic needs, the better it provides an overall framework and foundation for having the ability to transform the society, and the better it serves their needs and abilities in terms of defending themselves and defending their revolution. So this is something to be looked into and learned from. In terms of the revolution in the U.S. and, for example, Mexico and Central America and so on, a lot of this depends on how the revolutionary struggles actually go down in these countries. One of the things we've pointed to in our party's program, a principle that we've emphasized, is that there is nothing whatsoever sacred about the present borders of the USA, that they were forged in blood and plunder. There's a whole question of the theft of land. There's a whole question of the resolution of what's left over as a result of the theft of that land. There's the question of land and autonomy, as I spoke to it earlier, but there's also the question of the relation with Mexico. How all that works out and where territory that's now part of the U.S. will end up, what it'll be part of, will all have to be worked out in the course of the revolution that goes on in these countries. And if you think about it, it's almost impossible to conceive of a revolution that would be made in either of these countries, speaking specifically of Mexico and the U.S., which wouldn't very closely and very strongly interconnect with the struggle in the other country. Can you imagine, for example, that the ruling class of the U.S. would allow a revolutionary socialist state to be created in Mexico without seeking to smash and drown that in blood? On the other hand, can you imagine that a revolutionary struggle in Mexico would not have very powerful repercussions, reverberations, and effects within not only the Southwest, but throughout the territory of the United States, overwhelmingly in a very positive way? So there's a very close interconnection here between the revolutionary struggles in these two countries, for example. And it'll be very important to build more and more closely the unity of these struggles in these two countries as they develop. And again, how all this works out will be determined in the actual course of these revolutions. We can have general principles like the one that I said about nothing sacred about the borders of the U.S., but how it's going to actually work out, even how the revolutionary struggle for power and defend power is carried out in each country will be greatly affected by what's happening, not only by what the reactionaries and the oppressors and the imperialists are doing, but also what the masses of people are doing on each side of the border. Maybe the result of the revolution in this part of the world will be some kind of a socialist state that includes parts of the U.S. and parts of Mexico as they're now constituted, and not something that includes all 48 states and Alaska and Hawaii in the same way in which the U.S. exists now. We don't know that, but we have to keep an open approach to this. And we have to build on the principles but apply them concretely as the struggle develops. If a revolution develops in Mexico and they can win half of the U.S. in that revolution, good for them, and let's support them all the way. But at the same time, let's not stop there and rest on that. Let's also try to use that as a springboard and a force to increase the revolutionary struggle within the U.S. to finish off this whole thing and build something radically different and better in its place. So that's sort of the specifics of that, but the more general principle that's being gotten at here is how do you overcome these national boundaries and borders? Well, I spoke of the fact that revolution does get made one or a few countries at a time, and generally is not going to get made everybody all at once. Lenin said it at one time, talking about this contradiction, that if we waited for revolution to be made everywhere before it got made anywhere, we'd all end up hanging suspended in midair, and revolution would never happen anywhere. When the opportunity arises, when the situation emerges which makes possible revolution, when the crisis sharpens, you have to go for it and get as much as you can. Then you have to, when the dust settles, consolidate what you've got, look around and figure out how you're going to both carry forward the revolution in whatever territory you've won and seek to expand and support it elsewhere, near and far away in the world. But as more and more socialist states are brought into being, they will have a different kind of relation and unity that will actually be concretely and materially possible between the people in those countries in a way that's not possible now. In other words, let's say that in South Asia, or in Europe, for example, or in the North America, including Mexico, we get revolutions eventually in socialist states emerging in large parts of these territories differently at different times. Well, then you will have the task of those leaders of those socialist states getting together and also getting together with the whole international movement and starting to figure out how to concretely forge and develop higher forms of unity that begin to transcend and go beyond the limited barriers and boundaries of those particular countries. Transitional forms of cooperation between, let's say, the socialist state that might arise in what's now the U.S. or part of it, and a socialist state that would arise in Mexico or part of it, and maybe part of Central America too. Transitional forms where you cooperate, say, for example, in economic projects, where you pool your resources and work together. Maybe also developing certain supranational, that is above national, political institutions to help carry out and administer these projects that you're developing to help develop things on an economic level above particular countries. Not only having cultural exchanges, but maybe developing cultural forms that get spread throughout both countries. All these kind of ways in which you begin to move beyond these boundaries that separate people into countries, even before the time when we've reached communism and all these boundaries have finally been knocked down. So this is a very good question, and it's something worth thinking about a lot more, but these are a few ideas that occur to me in trying to speak to some of this question. Now finally, as far as written questions, because we wanted to allow time for people to ask questions from the floor, so to speak. The question is, given how crucial the revolutionary upsurge of the 60s was in forging the leadership of the RCP, how can a new generation of revolutionary leadership be brought into being in the absence of such a revolutionary upsurge? Well, those were favorable times. There was a revolutionary upsurge generally in the world, in many different forms and many different levels and many different kinds of programs and ideologies. But there was a general revolutionary ferment in the world, and this did find very broad expression even within the U.S. itself. I mean, this even penetrated into some of the mainstream, silly, popular culture. Like if some of you might remember the movie Car Wash. It was made in the 70s, and there's a scene in there where the son of the owner of the car wash brings in the Red Book and is trying to propagandize the other people working in the car wash about how great the Red Book is. Well, this was kind of silly on one level, but it reflected something about what was going on in the culture. There was another movie made with Peter Sellers called I Love You, Alice B. Toklas. And this was all about how, the Alice B. Toklas is a woman who developed this recipe for making cookies with marijuana, I think. And it involved this guy, Peter Sellers, who was a mainstream, really straight by the book lawyer, who's supposed to have one of these marriages that's sort of, almost like a merger, And at the last minute, he drops out and goes and joins his brother in kind of a hippie life, and he keeps going back and forth between these two lives. And at one point, his brother takes him to a bookstore and says, "Oh, the Red Book, you really got to get one of these." So this kind of is a reflection, even reaching into the mainstream culture, what was going on in the society at that time, especially among the youth of different nationalities, but not only them. And of course, this provided very favorable terms and conditions for people to develop into revolutionaries and into communists. Now, naturally, it didn't happen automatically. Just because there was all this stuff around, just because there was a Red Book there, you didn't have to read it. And just because you read it didn't mean you understood it. And just because you read it and understood it didn't mean you really went deeper and understood something more fundamental than that. I mean, the Red Book is a condensed version of a lot of things. It's very good, obviously, but to really understand these things and really develop as a communist, you have to go a lot deeper and a lot broader than that. You have to get into a lot of the underlying principles that are being spoken of and concentrated there. And you have to get into all the complexities of this. But this general kind of atmosphere created very favorable conditions for that. It's true. This is the situation in which I myself and others in the RCP, or what became the RCP, this is the context in which many of us developed. But of course, we shouldn't romanticize that. There were lots of people who developed in that time, became very radicalized, even became revolutionary-minded, who did not become Maoists, who did not become communists. They went in other directions, or they proclaimed themselves Maoists and communists, but it wasn't really that. And when some real twists and turns and some real tests came, like when the revisionists seized power in China, they just fell all apart. So it wasn't some kind of automatic or easy thing to be, oh, you know, everybody was being a communist then, man. It was just, you know, all you had to do was fall into it. It wasn't like that. And a lot of people got killed in that period of time, especially members of the Black Panther Party, who might have also developed into revolutionary leaders in a more developed way, but never got the chance. This is the way it goes. Some of this is accident. Who emerges and who doesn't as a revolutionary leader, and what emerges as a vanguard party. One of the questions we didn't get into here, we didn't have time, is somebody asked the question of, did I think that as a white male I could actually lead the revolution? Well, the answer is no, not as a white male, but I think I could play a leading role in it as a communist. You know, this is the challenge. What you follow is not people based on, you know, what nationality they are, what gender they are, and so on. But whether they really represent the way forward out of all this, and whether they have a plan and a program for actually leading people in that way. And developing in that kind of a way, like I said, there's a lot of accident that goes into that. A lot of other people who might have emerged as leaders in forming the new vanguard party reached a turn in the road and couldn't keep going forward on the right road for a lot of different reasons, or maybe they got killed and thrown in jail and didn't have the opportunity to do it. So we shouldn't idealize that period of time. There were very favorable conditions, but first of all, on the one side, it's not automatic that you're going to develop into a communist out of conditions like that, or that you can forge the leadership necessary to form a vanguard party out of all that. See, that's something else I want to say, just a little detour here. Leadership is not a matter of ego. It's not a matter, at least proletarian leadership, communist leadership, it's not a matter of asserting that you know better than everybody else, you're smarter than everybody else, and everybody should follow you blindly without questioning what you say. Leadership is essentially a matter of responsibility. It's a matter of being willing to be ruthlessly scientific, caring enough about this revolution, having a deep enough grounding and understanding that this revolution is necessary and possible, to be willing, and on that basis to develop the ability to apply yourself to actually lead this revolution and to take up all the daunting and heavy responsibilities that go into actually providing that leadership. Learning, but also leading, and not shirking from the responsibility. Yes, I'll say it straight up. I'm ready, and I'm willing to take the responsibility of leading this revolution all the way. And our party is willing and ready to do the same thing. But this is a matter of responsibility. It's a matter of taking this seriously. It's a matter of saying, this is where this needs to go. This is where this is tending to go. These are the forces that are resisting and pulling back away from it. This is what has to be overcome. This is what has to be overthrown. This is how people have to be led. This is how we have to go out and work among people and learn from them while we're giving them leadership. This is the process of the mass line that has to be applied. These are the problems that have to be studied. This is what it means to lead. It means you're willing and you're ready to take that responsibility, and you're prepared not just as an individual, but collectively in the party and together with the masses of people who come forward to join the revolution. You're ready to carry that all the way through and to take up every challenge, both in theory and in practice, that has to be confronted and dealt with in order to make that revolution and contribute to it in the whole world. That's what it means to develop and to take the responsibility as a vanguard and to develop revolutionary leadership. Now, while there were particular circumstances that were favorable to develop people like that out of the 60s, there are also plenty of favorable conditions to do that now. That's why you see many young people coming forward as communists right now, a number of whom are sitting right in this room. Where did they come from? They came out of the upsurges of this time. They came out of a different way, not the same way as the 60s, a different way that things are posing themselves now. They came out of recognizing, as we recognized then, that all these things stem from this same system. As they were introduced to this idea, they embraced it and took it up. And that's how they began to develop and are continuing to develop as communists. Now, in order to bring forward new leaders in any kind of period, there's lots of upsurge going on now. Look around you. Even in Vietnam, we didn't have 1 million or more people demonstrating against the war at that time. Overall, things were more advanced than they've gotten to be now. But there are plenty of elements of upsurge and resistance now that holds great potential. And it's a very tricky and complicated issue how you develop new leaders when you already have leaders. Because there's a tendency when you have long years of experience, well, first of all, there's a tendency to get stuck in your ways. That's one thing you have to struggle against all the time. Constantly trying to not get stuck in your ways and to recognize new things that emerge that might look to you like nothing significant, but then you look deeper and you dig deeper and you see that they do represent something that's shaking things loose. So there's not getting stuck in your ways and stuck in a rut. There are positive and negatives to being a veteran, to having been around in the struggle for a long time. The positives are obvious. You gain a lot of experience. You learn a lot. One of the things you develop is a certain subtlety about things. You don't see things in oversimplified terms. You understand the complexities of things. At the same time, you see the simplicity within the complexity. What do I mean by that? Like, for example, to actually make a revolution is very complex. But it's also very simple that we need this revolution, and that's what we have to do. And you have to not lose sight of either part of that. But then there's a question of not just a question of not getting stuck in a rut or stuck in your ways. But there's also a question of not getting in the way of new people sometimes. Because you can look at what people are doing who are new and you have years of experience and you said, I've seen this movie before. I know where this is going. Well, sometimes you do and sometimes you don't because it's not nothing's ever exactly the same as the way it was before. But even when it is and its main line's the same, there's still always new things to learn. And there's still always much to learn from people who are newly encountering these things and maybe coming up with new ways of confronting it that you didn't think of before. Yes, there's a temptation to say, well, look, we know how to do this. You know, I like this new generation, but let's face it, they make a lot of fucking mistakes. And it's very tempting to say, well, we just can't let them take this initiative here because these are not times when we can make a lot of mistakes. This is a serious situation we're dealing with. These people that we're up against, the core of this ruling class, they're not playing. The shit that I was talking about is not some kind of a thing I made up. The dangers that are represented are very real. And mistakes can cost a lot in this situation. So it's very difficult to handle this contradiction of saying, okay, let's let people take initiative even if they make some mistakes. Some that I might have made too, and some that are all their own. Because if we don't let that happen, first of all, we're not going to learn as much as we might learn, including from how they handle it, that might be different and even better in some ways than, to our surprise, the way we might have handled it. And second of all, if we don't do that, they're never going to learn in this whole furnace of the struggle and even of making mistakes, how to advance to the next level so that they can develop more as leaders and come forward. So part of it is actually leading people to develop as leaders, but part of that is knowing when to assist and when to get the fuck out of the way. And that's not easy to determine. One of the hardest things and one of the most important things in life in general, and especially in the revolutionary movement and in socialist society, is knowing what are the things and when are the circumstances in which you really have to pay a lot of focused and very concrete and detailed and calibrated attention to everything? And what are the situations and what are the circumstances in which you should really step back and let things develop? This comes up all the time. You're working with other people. You want them to take initiative. Well, when are the times when you really have to kind of walk together with them step by step to help them do it until they can do it more on their own? And what are the times and circumstances when you just have to have a general discussion and then let them go and get out of the way? So bringing forward new leaders is also a matter of handling that kind of contradiction. But there is a strategic importance to this. But one of the principles we stress, whether you're talking about youth and people with more experience, or you're talking about people of different genders or different nationalities, leadership is not a joke, and leadership is not a matter of tokenism. Leadership is responsible to the masses of people here and all over the world. Leadership is something that has to be brought forward on the basis of people developing the ability and being helped to develop the ability to actually lead for real, to actually apply the revolutionary ideology and scientific methods to solve the real contradictions you're up against. Otherwise, what we're doing is playing around so that we can feel good among ourselves and forgetting about the larger world and the masses of people out there, not just here but all over the world. You can feel good setting up arrangements that look good to other people. But what about the real contradictions that the masses of people are up against and the ways in which they're suffering every day? Are you really doing something to change that? Or are you just playing around? Developing leadership has to be done in line with and in mind of actually changing the world. That's what I'm trying to say. You have to change the world out here. It doesn't do any good if we don't change the world. I don't care whether we look young or old, what nationality or gender. If we don't change the world, the masses of people are going to be fucked again. And that's not what we're about. That's not what this is about. Yes, we have to bring forward the youth. We have to bring people forward from among the oppressed nationalities and from among the proletariat. And we have to develop them not only as communists, but as communist leaders. And we are doing that, and we have to do more. But it's got to be on the basis of applying this ideology to change the world and to mobilize the masses of people and lead them to emancipate themselves, or else it doesn't mean anything. And that's what we're about. That's the standards we apply. That's what we're aiming for. And that's what we're thinking about and keeping uppermost in our mind when we're working to bring forward leaders from among the youth and from among the proletariat and oppressed masses. And there's plenty of circumstances and conditions to do that, and there's plenty of work to be done and plenty of people to be brought forward. And I say, let's get busy with it.
Okay, we're going to take some questions from the floor.
Yeah, my question is in relationship to the Black Panther Party and the death of Huey Newton. What do you think were the reasons for Huey Newton's death, and what were your impressions of him and the Black Panther Party, especially during the early years?
Well, I don't really, to take the first part you asked, I don't really know about the reasons for his death exactly. There are a lot of different theories about that. Some of it having to do with the rivalries in the prison that carried over outside the prison. Some of it having to do with, questions about whether, this stemmed from the fact that Huey kind of got caught up in a whole drug thing, in the later part of his life. There are a lot of different theories, and I really don't honestly know the answer to the question of exactly what was at the base of why he got killed and who actually was responsible for this. What I do know is that, there was a certain tragedy here involved with Huey. Now, this is somebody who came forward in the 60s, who did something that had never been done before in the history of this country. From the very beginning of the Black Panther Party, from the very first time that he and Bobby Seale, the two of them, first stepped out, wrote up a program and formed the Black Panther Party for self-defense and went out on their patrols, their armed patrols, to confront and stop the people from the police from brutalizing and murdering people. That was something bold and new that had never been done before in the history of this country. But also what happened in that situation is, as the Black Panther Party started to grow, and first they took in Bobby Hutton and then a few others, and then it started spreading more rapidly. But within a very short period of time, Huey Newton got caught up in this whole situation in West Oakland, where there was some kind of confrontation with the police and some kind of shootout, and one cop got wounded and another got killed, and Huey got wounded. And then, as most of you know, he got charged with murdering this cop. And there was a whole long trial, and he was eventually convicted of manslaughter, I believe, and sentenced to, I think, maybe 15 years. But then there was a whole legal battle that went on, and it was reduced, and he got out in a few years. But what happened in this situation was that here he emerged, bringing something very new and revolutionary into the scene, and really holding up a model and shining a light that a lot of people were drawn to, not only black people but others. But very quickly, he was removed from the scene and taken out of the situation, out of circulation, so to speak, and put in prison and isolated. And it was, of course, very, very difficult, if not impossible, for him to continue trying to lead the Black Panther Party from inside jail. And the Black Panther Party, after this incident with Huey, and people started building support for Huey, just grew tremendously in a very short period of time. I remember one time Bobby Seale telling me that in 1 week, they had 500 people walk into the Black Panther office in New York City and want to join up. And they didn't, frankly, know what to do with them. They didn't know how to organize them and what to have them do. They were overwhelmed by the people coming in. They had just started out. And Huey was a leader, but they didn't have a lot of experience. It's like everybody starts out new doing anything. You take a bold step forward, but that doesn't mean you know everything that's going to come and how to deal with it all. You learn through the process of all this. And so Huey was removed from the scene, and the Panther Party had to confront how to build itself and defend itself and go forward in this situation where he was removed from the scene, but where they were growing by tremendous numbers in the face of tremendous murderous repression coming from the government and the police. And by the time Huey got back out of jail, around 1971, this incident in West Oakland happened, I think, in 1967. By the time he got back out of jail in 1971, I believe it was, things were very, very different. There was a whole developed Black Panther Party with different chapters and, frankly, different leaderships, some of them following somewhat different lines in different parts of the country. It was very complicated. And he didn't really know how to lead all this and where to take it. Obviously, he had ideas, and obviously he was trying to figure this out. But he'd been isolated from this whole situation during most of this whole period of this tremendous growth of the Black Panther Party. And at the same time, the police were infiltrating the Black Panther Party, causing disputes within the Black Panther Party, causing rivalries, trying to use the same tactics they used to set gangs against each other and shit like that, which resulted in some further problems. At the same time as they were outright killing people, they were fomenting this shit within. The FBI and all the rest of it. So Huey came out into this situation, and it was very difficult for him to figure out the road forward. And what happened then, around 71, to the Black Panther Party, happened to many revolutionary forces in the U.S. at that time. People began to run up against the fact that this revolutionary upsurge that had started in the 60s was not going to lead immediately to revolution, much as people wanted it. And so what do you do about that? How do you go forward in a situation where the struggle is maybe going to be a little longer term? And different people came up with different answers to that. And that happened within the Black Panther Party too. Eldridge Cleaver, for example, wanted to say, well, let's get it on right now. Fuck all this preparing for the future. Let's just get the deal going right now. And Eldridge had gotten caught up in this whole thing that happened in Oakland in '68, right after the assassination of Martin Luther King. And he had been forced to go into exile in Algeria, and from Algeria, he was promoting this as the answer. Let's get people together and just start up the whole armed struggle now. But Huey rejected that and was looking for a different solution, but he tended to fall into an approach of saying revolution is a long way off, and the only thing we can do now is to organize to meet people's needs for survival pending revolution in some far-off time. And that was a slogan they actually developed, survival pending revolution. And in this kind of view, while Eldridge was impatient and wanted to try to do it right then, which couldn't be done, and didn't lead to the advance of the revolution, on the other hand, Huey tended to separate the goal of revolution from whatever they were doing in the short run. So while they had programs that benefited people, the whole idea of revolution got lost increasingly. Now this wasn't just a matter of Huey's head. It was a matter of very difficult contradictions that everybody at that time was running up against. Like I said, how do you deal with a situation where the revolution we hoped and maybe even thought might have come right at that high point of the '60s, and maybe it could have even come if things had fallen into place in a different way, but it didn't. And then you had to confront, what do we do about that? And after that upsurge of the '60s, if you go into the '70s, things kind of cooled out a bit. There wasn't the same upsurge in the same way. There was still a lot of sentiment for change, but there wasn't the same upsurge. So what do you do in the face of that? And I think my own sense of this, from what I know about it, is that as this increasingly developed in the '70s, I don't know if people remember the '70s, that was a pretty horrible time, especially the late '70s. Especially if you've been through the '60s and everything that represented, and boy, it was hard to make it through the '70s. You know, you looked around and where is it, you know? It's not like now when there's not a lot of outpouring of struggle, but there's also not a lot of people just saying everything's fine or let's just cool it out. There's a lot of what people refer to sometimes as intense calm right now. Things are still boiling, and you can see how they could easily erupt again on an even bigger scale. What brought people forward in protest, for example, around the Iraq War and this whole thing Bush and them are doing has not gone away, and people know it's not going away. But in the mid and late '70s, it was different. There was kind of feeling of, oh man, where'd all that go? You know, if you came through the '50s like I did, I'm going to admit it. If you came through the '50s like I did, and then you went through the '60s, you thought, God damn, things will never be like that again. You just kind of thought, well, yeah, there'll be, you know, ebbs and flows, ups and downs, but things are just going to keep going up. That's what I thought. That's what most people thought who came through the '60s like that. I see people around here who went through that shaking their heads. We all know that. But it didn't work out that way. You learned that things went back. The ruling class regrouped. The world changed. They developed some strategic means and tactical means for dealing with what happened with the whole Vietnam thing and the aftermath of that. So it was a very hard time. And I think Huey came out of jail, and I know it's a long answer, but I'm trying to speak to what you were raising. You know, he came out of jail and he became disoriented when this happened. There wasn't what there was that he'd been part of. And he couldn't lead in the same way, and he didn't know the answers to these things. It wasn't easy to find the answers to this. It was very difficult. There were no easy answers. And as a result of this, Huey did get into some bad shit. And he did get caught up in some drugs and some other things. And I think that whatever happened that actually led to his death, there was kind of a spiral downward where he became more and more disoriented. I mean, you can see that thing that's done, you know, that show on the movie that was made about Huey Newton by Roger Guinevere Smith. It kind of captures that. It's kind of freaky when you're watching it, if you were around and you knew Huey, because sometimes you really can believe it's Huey Newton right there. And you can kind of get a sense of the inner turmoil that's going on. And I think that was real. I obviously don't know all of it. You know, I'm not pretending to know that, but that's the sense I have. And that by the 80s and the end of the 80s when Huey was killed, you know, he kind of lost his bearings in that kind of a way. But that doesn't change or eliminate the fact that what he did in bringing forward the Black Panther Party was a tremendous contribution to the overall revolutionary struggle. It was the most advanced thing that had come forward to that time. And there are many important and valuable lessons that can be learned and have to be learned from that. And it's a legacy in many ways. There's some things we have to learn from in a negative sense of not doing and mistakes not making, things we have to go beyond. But there are also many crucial things that we have to take up and build on.
All right, well, I'll take the woman there in the kind of orange head thing. Use the mic just to make sure.
I just wanted to say thanks for coming here and speaking to us, first of all, but this isn't going to be like an intellectual question, but we don't really know you on like a personal level, really. I'm just wondering what your favorite band is and your favorite movie.
Well, I will say you guys are persistent because you wrote that question up. I saw that. Well, I don't know if I have like one particular band. I mean, I like The Coup, for example. I like Peter Tosh a lot when he was alive, even though he was religious. I like Ozzy Motley a lot. And there are a lot of other people out there. I want to check out this song, this cut, Where's the Love? Seems like that maybe has a few things to say. So there are a lot of things that are need to be checked out and looked into, and a lot of new things always getting brought forward. But those are some I can think of off the top of my head. As far as movies, well, it depends on, for what. Sometimes you just want a movie to eat popcorn and not have to think too much, And then sometimes you want something more with a movie. I know, one movie, I know Marlon Brando. Let me move it this way. I know Marlon Brando was once asked, what was the movie that he made that he liked the best and was most proud of, and he answered the movie Burn. Now, I don't know if people know about that movie. It was made in the late 60s and was about an anti-colonial struggle. Think in a Caribbean island country. That's a very good movie. There are a lot of other good movies that things that have in various ways raised important questions or indicted the system in various ways. I don't necessarily have one favorite, but like I said, sometimes when you go to a movie, you just kind of want to, turn off your mind and not have to think too much as long as it's not offensive and reactionary. And there are other times you want more meat. There's some good movies out now. There's a movie out of France called Chaos. I don't know if people have seen that, but it's a very heavy movie about the relationship I don't want to give away the movie, but the relationship between the situation of North African immigrants in France and how the oppression of women interconnects with all that. There's another very good movie called Pretty Dirty Thing, The Dirty Pretty Thing. There's another very heavy movie out called The Magdalene Sisters that does a lot of exposure of really feudal oppression of women still going on in Ireland. So there are a lot of different movies that keep coming out. I think this is a part of the general ferment that's going on, how it's getting expressed in the cultural arena. And one of the things that's very important is always have an orientation of looking for things that are new and not rejecting them out of hand because they're new and different. In our paper here recently, they ran some segments of an interview that I did years ago where I talked about how when Jimi Hendrix came out on the scene, I really had the wrong attitude toward that, I kind of had what you might call kind of a narrow nationalist response to it, like, what's he doing playing all this fucking hippie music for all these psychedelic white people, But that was really missing a lot of what was going on, and I've tried to draw a lesson from that, and it's important to draw lessons from those kind of things, to look for what might be new and not to reject things out of hand because they're different and they're not what you're used to. So I think there are a lot of ways in which in the movies and music and culture in general, we should be looking for things. They don't have to be new. But we should be looking for the things that are raising questions, making people think, and also, have some artistic quality that conveys this in a good way and gives people, some sustenance that way. But we shouldn't reject new things that come forward. We should be careful not to have an orientation of, oh man, that's not what I'm into. Take a look at things, decide, like Mao said, you should take a sniff at everything and decide whether to support and boycott it. And just because it's new and different doesn't mean it's good, but it also doesn't mean it should be rejected out of hand.
Okay, we're going to take about 2 more.
My question, I wrote it on a card too, was if there was a crisis today that presented a situation where it looked like a revolution could be successful, is the RCP ready today to act on that? And I had kind of a 3-part thing. Do they have the personnel, the equipment, weapons, materials that they need? And are people trained to do this now? Or if it happened 2 years from now, would they be?
Well, as I tried to lay out, our approach to revolution is that you have to create the necessary political conditions among the people and organize the people, and that has to come together with an objective revolutionary situation. The need now is not a military one, except in the sense that we have to develop and study military history in order to learn. We have to take it up in the realm of theory now. The need now is political. It's not a question of having the training and having the arms and all that kind of thing. That's not what we're paying attention to. Because if you don't have the masses of people, if you don't have millions of people who are politically prepared and organized in that way, you can never make a revolution. And trying to acquire arms and accumulate things in that way is not the road that's going to lead to that. In fact, that's going to lead to our getting smashed. In order to have a revolutionary army in a situation like this, you have to have a revolutionary people. It's out of a revolutionary people, millions of people, that a revolutionary army will eventually be forged and developed when the conditions ripen and there's a change, a qualitative change in the objective situation which makes revolutionary struggle for power possible. We have to be preparing the ground politically and doing the political work and developing the organization among the people that can enable that revolutionary people in millions to have a chance at winning. Think about what we're up against. We're not going to be able to go up against them and match them in weaponry. Obviously, when you fight a revolutionary war, whenever that comes in the future, you don't throw books at the other side. A war is a war. But we're never going to be able to match them in equipment or even in training in that kind of a way. What we have to match is our strength. That's what we have to rely on. We have to match our strength against them. We have to be able to overwhelm them with a politically conscious and determined revolutionary people of millions who, when the time comes, when the revolutionary situation is ripe, then get organized and transformed into a revolutionary force capable of fighting and defeating them. And that will require tremendous sacrifice when the time comes, and the time is not now or tomorrow, or I don't think next week or even next year. I can't say when it will be. That's not the point. The point is we need a revolutionary people of millions, a people who's politically conscious and sees the need for revolution, first of all. And when it does come, it's going to require tremendous sacrifice. Not that we're going to blindly throw numbers of people into the meat grinder. But in order to overwhelm a force that will be superior in training and definitely in technology and in military experience, you have to have the bedrock organization among the proletarian intersections of the people of thousands, but not just thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, and ultimately millions of people actively taking part in supporting this. It has to be the act of millions and millions of people, or we will never have a chance. And that's what we have to focus our attention on if we ever want to get to the point where it can really be done.
woman in the denim jacket?
And this will be our last question.
I don't exactly know how to ask this, but I'm going to try my best. I just want to know how you felt about the minority youth not being seen as much as they could be here in the room. I'm not a token youth because I know I'm here because I want to be here, and all the other minority youth that are here want to be here, but seeing as though it's very hard for minority youth to make it out to things like this, how do you feel about, you know, trying to get more of us out and, you know, trying to spread it just a little bit further? And I know that we want to express the MLM and we want to do all of that, but it's so hard and it's so overwhelming, you know, under the circumstances that a lot of minority youth face today, that they can't wrap their brain around, you know, the types of things that we have, you know, today. And I want to know just how do we get more people out?
Well, I think that's a very good and obviously very important question. And yes, there is a great need to make real strides in doing this. And one of the key ways in doing this is that those who are here have to play a key role in going out and bringing others. But one of the contradictions that I think you're speaking to, which is very difficult, is the very things that are the things that mean that people need revolution. And the conditions for people who most need revolution are also some of the things that make it hard for them to get into the revolution, especially at the beginning. Because of all the things they are denied, because of all the ways in which their life is full of one hardship and crazy thing after another, after another, after another, and the ways in which merely the struggle to survive and get by from one day to the next and deal with all that craziness makes it hard, like you said, to be able to get your mind around these other things, or even to be able to pay some attention to them. So this is a real problem. You know, I would like to see you and others. Let's get a big discussion going among people who are already coming forward about this very question. Let's get down and dig into this and really get down to the nits and grits of it and try to figure it out more. Because I do not believe that the people who most need revolution are the people who are least capable of understanding what this revolution is about. I do not believe that. But I do understand, and I think it's very important, that we have to find ways to bring this to them in a way that they can take it up, not because we have to feed them pablum, not because they're any less capable of understanding this and all of its complications, but because we have to find a way to break through the difficult conditions that people face and enable them to begin to come into contact with this, and once they do, then we can build on that and bring them forward more. So I think this is a very, very real and very, very important question. There is no easy answer to it, and I don't have an easy answer to it, except that we need to start with what we do have, what advances we have made. And you who pose this question and others who are in a similar situation need to continue to be a part of figuring out the answer to this question together with the party as a whole. Because we do have to find a way to overcome this contradiction that the things that mean that people really need this revolution mean it's also hard for them to get into it. They don't have some of the luxury of being able to stand back or step back and look at some of these things and get into them. But that doesn't mean they can't do it or won't do it. It means it's on us to figure out the ways to enable them to do that, to connect with them, and to bring them forward to do it and to learn from them while we're doing it. So we really should get down on this. We should dig into this after this meeting and in an ongoing way to really figure out the answer to that question. Because I firmly believe, and everything that I do believe is bound up with this, that when you talk about this revolution, when you talk about this MLM, we have the phrase that when you take MLM to the proletariat, to the most basic masses, you're taking it home. Because this speaks to the situation of the masses of people and speaks to what they need in order to get themselves up and out of all this madness. Yet the contradiction is because they're caught up in all this, it's difficult for them to take hold of this. So we need to, in an ongoing way, struggle through this contradiction so that we get more and more of sort of a critical mass where more people are coming forward and taking this up. And as that happens, we kind of get a whole thing going where the more people are taking it up, the more people are able to take it up because they see other people that they can relate to taking it up themselves. And they can see people who in the same conditions they're in are able to conquer this thing, are able to take a hold of it and master it and use it and move with it to begin mobilizing other people. So we really have to take this up. I thank you for asking this question, and we really have to take this up in an ongoing way and solve it together.
I'm 89 years young. I hear them talking about a revolution, and they celebrate what they done in the past. But there ain't no celebration until we change things, and then that's when we have the celebration. I want to know when we're going to change. I want to see something done about it, not change.
All right. Well, you know, we're underway. We're starting, and we have to try like hell to make something happen while you're still with us. We want you to see this change. But things are already happening. Things are changing. People are being organized. People are coming forward. And we do have to take it toward revolution. I know it's good when you're 89 to be impatient. And we need some of that impatience that you can bring. And you can be an inspiration to some of the people who are much younger than that to actually use all their energy to push this thing forward. We can't have any guarantees or promises about how fast this is going to move. But what we can do is apply ourselves with all of our energy, all of our determination, all of our understanding to push it forward as fast as we can, as far as we can. And I'd like to unite with your spirit in calling on everyone to do that. You know, we did get a lot of questions, and there were questions about the history of socialist countries, questions about Stalin. We weren't able to get to these questions, not because we don't think they're important or not because we don't want to speak to them, but it's just there's only so much time we could do, and we appreciate very much that people ask these questions. And even if it's not possible to speak to them here and now, this is a very important part of everything we're doing, is to learn from what people are raising, and we will find ways. The party as a whole will find ways to speak to these questions and to get back to people and engage them about these questions, because this is all a part of the whole process of making revolution and that we're all about.